You're tuned in to Ghost Frequency, where the silence of the wilderness holds more than just the wind. Tonight we head north to Alaska, a land worshipped for its untouched beauty, endless forests, and frozen horizons. But beneath the northern lights and snow-laden valleys lie stories that were never meant to surface. These are not legends passed around a campfire to scare children. These are real accounts, pulled from forgotten case files, local reports buried in archives, and the trembling words of those who made it out alive, and those who never truly came back. Some names and dates have been altered to protect the living, but the core of each chilling event remains intact. In Alaska, the wilderness doesn't just surround you, it watches. And tonight, through 9 haunting testimonies, you'll learn just how quickly the beauty of isolation can turn into a nightmare no one hears you scream from. The glacial air of early January bit at Jolene Hawthorne, colder than she'd ever known, as she steered her de Havilland Beaver through Alaska's pale, sun-starved sky. Below, the Chukchi Sea lay like a frozen, scarred titan. Each mile north, the landscape grew more stark, more unforgiving, yet a strange, almost magnetic pull drew her deeper into its brutal beauty. Minnesota's flat plains, where she once dreamt of flight, felt a lifetime away. Now flying wasn't a dream. It was a desperate lifeline strung between isolated villages and the world beyond. Kotzebue always welcomed her with open arms and the clamor of life. Usually eager Inupiat villagers, men to offload the heating fuel, medical supplies, and precious food, children to gawk at her silver bird, would jostle on the airstrip. But today, as her wheels kissed the hard-packed snow, an unnerving silence fell. No barking dogs, no children's laughter echoing on the wind. Just an oppressive, pristine quiet that swallowed the roar of her engine whole. Jolene killed the prop, the sudden stillness almost deafening. Her breath plumed in the -30-degree air, each exhale a fragile cloud. Stepping onto the white expanse, a primitive dread coiled in her gut. She half expected the familiar warmth of a bustling Arctic community, but the village seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind, usually a storyteller, offered nothing but silence. With the cargo sled hitched, she began the solitary task of hauling supplies toward the village center, each step a muffled crunch in the fresh snow. The paths, usually worn by daily foot traffic, lay untouched. Houses stood neat, orderly, yet eerily vacant. Curtains drawn back as if hastily abandoned, coats still hung by doorways, hearths gaped with cold, dead ash. No smoke, not a wisp. In this merciless cold, that absence screamed louder than any alarm. "Hello?" Jolene's voice, a fragile thread in the vast stillness, unraveled into the frigid air. "Supplies. Help has arrived." But only the mocking echo of her own plea answered from the empty buildings. The grocery store, usually the village's beating heart, was a frozen diorama of a life suddenly paused. Its front doors gaped open, a silent testament to a frantic departure. Shelves remained well-stocked. A half-eaten sandwich on the counter had begun to molder, beside a tattered newspaper dated 2 weeks prior. And in the till, a stack of undisturbed bills. Panic began to prick at the edges of Jolene's composure. She unclipped her radio, thumbed the transmit button. Only a hiss of static answered her desperate calls on the council frequency. The emergency channels offered nothing but white noise. What happened here? Pressing on, protocol her sole navigator, she reached the community center. Chaos had been frozen mid-motion. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, a calendar on the wall stuck on December 15th, unmarked since. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing snapshots of lives abruptly halted. Coffee cups on tables, meeting notes strewn like fallen leaves, a child's drawing of a polar bear taped to a wall, its innocent gaze fixed on the quiet horror. Then, a sharp slam from upstairs. Jolene's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird caged by fear. She ascended the creaking stairs, flashlight beam jittering. Rooms lay empty, save for scattered remnants. Open books, a doll face down, clothes flung as if discarded in a panicked escape. On one wall, a note, smeared but unmistakable, chilled her to the bone. "We fled into the storm. The shadow is coming. Do not follow us into the dark." A new kind of cold, one that had nothing to do with the temperature, seeped into her bones. What shadow? What storm could force an entire village to vanish, leaving everything behind? She pushed on, checking the surrounding homes. The signs of abrupt departure grew more stark. Snowmobiles half buried, sleds tipped with supplies spilling onto the snow, children's toys scattered as if mid-play. Many doors left wide open, invited in the killing cold that would have burst pipes within hours. Through the biting air, her breath dense and cloud-like, Jolene spotted them, fresh footprints, deep and hurried, unbroken by new snow. They led away from Kotzebue, a narrow path etched across the ice toward the frozen shoreline. Despite the gnawing pit of fear, a fierce compassion urged her to follow. Perhaps some had found shelter in the fishing huts. Perhaps they were waiting, trapped, for rescue. The air shifted as she stepped onto the sea ice. Above, the aurora shimmered, green and violet ribbons pulsing across the sky, casting an otherworldly glow that made the ice seem to breathe with an inner light. From behind a weathered fishing shack, a figure materialized. Pale and trembling, a man emerged, his face gaunt with hunger and exposure, his clothes tattered. But in his eyes a desperate relief flickered, raw and profound. I was waiting," he rasped, voice cracked from cold and exhaustion. "Everyone else, they fled into the storm and never came back. I stayed, hoping someone would come, hoping you would arrive." He introduced himself as Isaac, a local fisherman, separated from his people by a brutal, sudden blizzard 2 weeks prior. This storm, he whispered, was different. It brought with it a darkness, almost tangible, a shadow that moved with the wind, stalking the village streets like something alive and malevolent. The shadow drove them mad with terror, Isaac rasped, his voice raw, recounting how it had herded the villagers, a panicked flock, into the merciless wilderness. There, many had simply succumbed to the cold, their lives snuffed out by the Arctic's indifferent breath. Those who defied it, who tried to hide, were found next morning unmarked, yet utterly drained, their life force stolen. Jolene, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, wrapped the shrunken man in soft blankets from her emergency kit, pressing water and food into his trembling hands. His story, a chilling whisper of malevolence, froze her blood more effectively than the biting wind. Yet, she forced her mind to a calm, clinical focus. Keep Isaac alive. She raised the radio to her lips, the static crackle a stark counterpoint to the wild whispers in her head. "Kotzebue Airport, this is Jolene, requesting emergency medevac." The voice that answered was strained, brittle with worry. Other pilots had reported grotesque atmospheric disturbances, and several aircraft had simply vanished. Rescue, they confirmed, would be painfully delayed. Worsening conditions, hurricane-force winds, blinding whiteouts had grounded all flights. The medevac helicopter wouldn't reach them until the storm broke, perhaps not until tomorrow afternoon. Hopelessness clawed at the edges of her resolve, but Jolene shoved it back. She was a pilot. She was trained for this, even if this particular brand of peril veered sharply into the bizarre. Her survival instincts, honed by years in unforgiving skies, flared. Time to prepare for a long, cold night. Inside the rattling fishing hut, a small fire became her fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. Her senses stretched taut, every creak of the wooden frame, every whisper of snow against the window, every brittle snap of a branch outside sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Isaac's mumbled warnings about the shadow did nothing to soothe the raw edge of her nerves. Her imagination, a treacherous ally, painted sinister, dancing shapes just beyond the fire's embrace. The unnerving sensation of being watched was a constant, gnawing presence. Several times she swore she saw movement through the frosted panes, but her flashlight beam, cutting through the swirling snow, found only the ethereal dance of the aurora. Just as dawn's pale fingers stretched across the horizon, a distant thrum shattered the silence. The rhythmic whop-whop of helicopter blades sliced through the frigid air, growing steadily, purposefully louder. Then a bright orange beacon emerged from the morning haze. Isaac was whisked away, fragile, frostbitten, to the sanctuary of warmth and medicine. As the helicopter lifted, Jolene cast one final, lingering look at the village. Katsubu, a silent, lost ghost, slowly shrinking beneath the pale Arctic sun. The tale of that last supply run became a legend, whispered among pilots and locals, a chilling cautionary carol. Aviation authorities launched an investigation, but found no rational explanation for the village's stark abandonment. Search teams, venturing into the vast wilderness, found only scattered remains, victims of exposure and the brutal cold. Many pilots now steered clear of Kotibu after dark, wary of the shadows said to haunt its silent streets, a malevolent hunger consuming land and life. Kotibu was eventually declared uninhabitable, struck from official flight schedules. Yet some claim, on particularly active aurora nights, faint lights still flicker in its desolate heart. Jolene eventually moved on to calmer routes, kinder climates. But the memory, a cold, sharp shard, remained. It was a stark testament that the wild held secrets, dangers no one should ever underestimate. She never flew in Alaska again. When asked why she abandoned such a lucrative career, she would simply say, "Some places are better left undisturbed. Some shadows," she'd add, her gaze distant, "do not fade with the dawn, and some mysteries are too dangerous to solve." The last supply run had carved into her soul the chilling truth. Some forces lay beyond human comprehension, and sometimes the only wisdom is flight. Rodriguez Rod Espinosa never put much stock in the strange or the supernatural. Raised in the sprawling, sun-baked deserts of West Texas, his world was forged in the tangible oil fields by day, fixing fishing boats by night. His hands, calloused and strong, bore the story of honest labor. His face, etched by the harsh southwestern sun, mirrored a worldview shaped by the predictable mechanics of machinery and hard work. When the opportunity for a new start, an adventure to brag about in the bars of El Paso, called him to Alaska as a commercial fisherman, he answered without hesitation. Nome was unlike anything Rod had ever known. The vast, frozen plains of the sea stretched, a blinding canvas, broken only by the occasional cluster of fishing huts and the jagged silhouette of distant mountains, rising like ancient, stoic sentinels. The midnight sun, a strange and tireless companion in summer, blurred day into a perpetual twilight, reordering his internal clock. But it was the brutal winter months that truly unveiled the raw mystique of this remote world. Here, Rod learned of Nome's annual ice fishing contest, a beloved tradition that drew the scattered community together in the season's harshest grip. More than just a competition, it was a defiant celebration of survival, endurance, and the unbreakable bonds that anchored them when the outside world felt impossibly remote. At first, Rod was an outsider, his Texas draw a jarring note against their clipped northern accents. His techniques, honed on warm waters, felt clumsy and ineffective on the frozen Bering Sea. Yet, his sheer determination and an innate fishing skill slowly earned him a grudging acceptance among the tight-knit group of men and women who carved a living from these unforgiving waters. The tournament was a grueling test. Competitors wrestled hand-cranked augers through feet of solid ice, the effort exhausting in the sub-zero cold. They braved an incessant Arctic wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, and they cultivated the patience of saints, waiting for elusive catches in conditions that would send most sane people scrambling indoors. The fish beneath the ice cod, burbot, Arctic char, were prized not just for their size, but for their resolute ability to thrive in such a brutal environment. The day of the contest dawned with a vicious clarity. Skies crystal clear. Air so cold it seemed to crackle. 42 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze spit mid-air. The wind sweeping across hundreds of miles of frozen tundra carried the scent of wood smoke mingled with sea salt. Bundled in layers of caribou fur and modern insulation, Rod joined the crowd of fishermen, their faces already ruddy from the cold, but their eyes glinting with excitement and competitive fire. Throughout the morning, Rod watched, mesmerized by the skilled hands around him, veterans who read the ice like an ancient text, knowing precisely where to drill, how deep to set their lines. This was generational knowledge, passed down like an heirloom, essential for Arctic survival. Conversation drifted from friendly banter about past catches to hushed warnings about the sea's deeper secrets. Stories were shared, whispered rumors and folklore, passed down through generations like cautionary tales around a campfire. Old Henrik, a weathered Norwegian fisherman who had worked these waters for 30 years, leaned in, telling Rod about the Kalupalik, ancient Inuit spirits said to command the weather and the sea. "The ice has memory," Henrik murmured, his breath blooming in white clouds. "It remembers every soul that has passed through these waters, and sometimes it calls to them." Rod chuckled to himself, dismissing the tales as the superstitions of isolated people, minds warped by too many long, dark winters. He was a man of reason, of practical experience. The frozen world, he believed, held no place for old wives' tales and supernatural nonsense. Yet, as the contest wore on into the afternoon, a subtle, unsettling shift began. The ice beneath their feet started to hum. Softly at first, a low, vibrational drone that resonated through their boots, deep into their bones. It was almost subliminal, felt more than heard, like standing too close to a massive electrical transformer. Fishermen paused, casting nervous glances, their eyes drawn to the frozen surface with dawning unease. Rod felt it too, a faint tremor, quickening, pulsing beneath the vast frozen sea. It reminded him of the ground shaking when heavy machinery rumbled past the oil rigs back in Texas. But here, there was no machinery, nothing but ice, water, and the endless, silent expanse of the Arctic wilderness. Then, without warning, fishing lines began to rip taut with a savage ferocity, spools flying from reels, knocking several fishermen off their feet. Rod gripped his rod, both hands locked, feeling an enormous weight on the other end of his line. He pulled, expecting to haul up the largest cod of his life. But what emerged from the black water beneath the ice defied all reason, all explanation. Entwined upon his line was a grotesque creature, equal parts fish and living shadow. The sleek black skin of the creature pulsed, unnaturally luminous in the pale Arctic sun, as if it had risen from a phosphorescent abyss. Its eyes, twin points of cold alien light, seemed to bore into Rod's very soul. Impaled on his hook, the thing writhed, a guttural, mournful groan escaping it, a sound horribly close to human speech, yet from no language Rod had ever known. Chaos erupted across the fishing grounds. Lines taut under impossible strain, snapped with violent cracks. Ice augers and tackle boxes lay abandoned, their owners now a surge of desperate bodies. Seasoned men and women, veterans of polar bear encounters and Arctic gales, clawed for safety like terrified children. Below the fractured ice, shapes began to coalesce from the black water creatures that were part fish, part living shadow, their hollow, glowing eyes tracking the fleeing fishermen with malevolent intent. A bitter cold descended, sharper than before. Whispers rose from the panicked crowd, then full-throated cries. From the unseen depths, an eerie chorus of lament and warning echoed voices that filled the air from everywhere and nowhere. The words were unintelligible, yet steeped in such profound sadness and rage that some fishermen buckled, weeping uncontrollably, overwhelmed by emotions that were not their own. Rod stood frozen, his rational mind a shattered pain against the encroaching horror. The wind's howl, a constant companion in this desolate land, was swallowed by the unearthly chorus beneath them. Then, the ice itself began to groan, long and deep, cracking under the unimaginable weight of whatever pushed from below. Each splintering sound mirrored their primal fear, a prelude to the hungry darkness of the sea. The voices swelled, weaving narratives of lives cut short, fragmented tales of drowning, freezing, and being dragged into the abyss by something that should not exist. Rod strained, almost discerning individual words' names, pleas for help from those lost to these waters decades, even centuries ago. Panic became a tidal wave. The crowd fled towards the distant shore, abandoning gear worth fortunes, leaving behind a lifetime's worth of fishing dreams. Snowmobiles roared, their engines screaming against the wind, carrying multiple passengers clinging desperate to escape whatever had awoken beneath the frozen surface. Hours later, search and rescue teams arrived, dispatched by anxious families when the fishermen failed to return. They found only the vast, frozen silence of the Bering Sea. The ice lay smooth, unmarked by the terror that had propelled an entire community into headlong flight. Abandoned equipment had begun to freeze solid. The holes drilled for fishing showed no trace of the creatures. Local authorities, desperate for an explanation, dismissed the incident as mass hysteria, a product of extreme cold and isolation. They cited methane emissions from the seafloor as a possible cause for hallucinations, though privately, investigators admitted they had never seen anything like it. Elders in the community spoke in hushed tones of the ice, claiming more than just fish that day. It had claimed their very faith in the natural order, their understanding of the world's boundaries. Some whispered of ancient curses stirred by disturbance of the deep, others that the spirits of the lost had finally found a way to reach the living. Rod left Alaska shortly thereafter, carrying psychological scars that time would not fade. Nightmares began almost immediately, dreams of black water reaching, glowing eyes, voices calling his name from beneath the ice. Therapists in Texas listened, offered treatments, but none could erase the memory of that otherworldly chorus or the sight of creatures that defied existence. The annual ice fishing contest in Nome was never held again. The community's vote was unanimous. Some traditions were not worth risking whatever slept beneath the frozen sea. That stretch of ice became informally known as off-limits. No official signs were ever posted, but fishermen passed the knowledge down, a grim lesson in Arctic survival. In the years that followed, other strange reports surfaced from the same area. Pilots seeing lights under the ice, ships reporting odd sonar readings, and equipment failures during the brief summer thaws. But these incidents were easily dismissed, swallowed by the vastness and forgotten. Rod never returned to commercial fishing. He found work in construction in Texas, a place where the ground was solid and the darkness held only familiar, earthly fears. Yet, on the coldest nights, he still hears them, the voices calling from beneath the ice, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are too dangerous to unearth, some traditions too deadly to uphold. The ice fishing contest, meant to draw the community together, had instead ripped them apart, forcing them to confront the terrifying incompleteness of their world, the existence of forces beyond human comprehension. And deep beneath the frozen waves of the Bering Sea, the shadows waited patiently, forever hungry, forever calling to those who dared to venture too far onto the ice. Marcus Delra, fresh out of Louisiana State with a communications engineering degree, never imagined his highly specialized skills would take him to the desolate expanse of Alaska. But desperate times often dictated desperate measures, and the remote Bethel Communications Facility offered a salary triple what he could earn back home in Baton Rouge. The contract stipulated 18 months maintaining the radio infrastructure that connected this isolated town of 4,000 souls to the outside world. What the job posting neglected to mention, however, was that most of this work would be performed alone, under the endless shroud of the Alaskan winter night. The Bethel Communications Center sat 5 miles from town, a squat concrete bunker dwarfed by a forest of towering radio antennas. They clawed at the ink-dark sky like metallic fingers, reaching for the shimmering aurora borealis. Marcus was 3 weeks into his tenure, learning the labyrinthine systems from his predecessor, a grizzled technician named Pete, who radiated an almost desperate eagerness to escape Alaska. Pete had been unusually taciturn during the training, his instructions delivered with mechanical precision, his conversations sparse and purely technical. On Marcus's final day of training, as they shared steaming coffee from a thermos in the control room, Pete finally opened up. The room, lined with banks of radio equipment, cast an eerie green glow from its LED displays, illuminating the older man's weathered face. Outside, the wind howled across the tundra, rattling the building's metal siding with a sound like distant, mocking applause. "Listen, Marcus," Pete began, his voice low, his expression grave in the flickering electronic light. "You're going to hear things up here that don't make sense. Radio waves. They bounce strange in this part of Alaska. Atmospheric conditions, the northern lights, all sorts of scientific gibberish for what might come through those speakers." He gestured towards the communication arrays, a sweeping arc of his hand. "But there are some transmissions you just need to ignore. Turn the volume down, log them as interference, and move on with your shift." Marcus had laughed it off then, assuming Pete was just trying to spook the new guy. But as the Louisiana native settled into his solitary routine in the weeks that followed, he began to understand. The equipment picked up an astonishing array of signals, sometimes Russian military chatter drifting across the Bering Sea, sometimes fragmented conversations from high-flying aircraft, or ship-to-shore calls from vessels navigating the strait. Most nights, Marcus worked alone from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., monitoring equipment and performing routine maintenance on the transmitters that kept Bethel connected. The isolation rarely bothered him. He was comfortable in his own company, and the pay made the loneliness tolerable for 18 months. He brought books, installing a small television in the break room to pass the long hours. It was in his 6th week that Marcus heard the voice that would irrevocably alter his understanding of the world. He was performing a routine check on emergency frequencies when a woman's voice crackled through the static, clear as day, despite the abysmal signal quality. "This is Jennifer Walsh calling for help," she stated, her voice tight with desperation. "My coordinates are 61.4 degrees north, 161.8 degrees west. I have been stranded here for 2 days. My snowmobile broke down, and I need immediate assistance. Please respond if anyone can hear this transmission." Marcus snatched up his logbook, his pen poised. Emergency calls were rare in the Alaskan bush, but not unheard of. It was his responsibility to relay any distress signal to a rescue service. The transmission was a ghost in the wires, a voice calling out from a place Marcus couldn't reach. He strained, every fiber of his being trying to bridge the gap, but the signal, like a whisper against a gale, was one way, fading just as abruptly as it had arrived. Twice more, the woman's desperate plea echoed through the speakers before dissolving into the hiss and crackle of static. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus became a phantom himself, chasing an echo. He wrestled with his equipment, a frantic dance of dials and frequencies, while simultaneously patching a call through to the Alaska State Troopers. The coordinates given, somewhere southwest of Bethel, pinpointed a wilderness notorious for its savage terrain and fickle weather. The trooper on the other end, his voice a low rumble, jotted down the details, promising a search party at first light. 3 days later, the stark headline of the local newspaper delivered a chilling anticlimax. No one had been found. The search team stumbled upon the skeletal remains of a snowmobile, years old, half swallowed by snow and stubborn vegetation. But the true horror emerged only after a more meticulous sweep of the area. Human remains, identified as Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife researcher lost in that exact location 7 years prior. Marcus tried to force a rational explanation into the gaping maw of the impossible. Ionospheric skip, perhaps. A vintage transmission, caught in the cosmic currents for years, finally delivered to his antenna. A scientific stretch, he knew, but stranger things had happened in the ethereal world of radio waves. Yet the brittle facade of logic began to crumble as the weeks bled into similar terrifying incidents. 2 weeks after the ghostly call from Jennifer Walsh, another distress signal pierced the night. This time, a man's voice, raw with desperation, identifying himself as Robert Cunningham. Lost in a blizzard near the same coordinates, he pleaded for help, his supplies dwindling. Marcus, a man carved from protocol, meticulously logged the transmission and alerted the authorities. The next day, the cold truth emerged. Robert Cunningham, a geologist, had vanished 5 years earlier in that very region. His body, found months after his disappearance, bore the unmistakable marks of a severe blizzard and death by exposure. As winter's icy grip tightened and the nights stretched interminably, the phantom calls became a macabre leitmotif. Marcus began to dread his overnight shifts, a gnawing certainty that, at some point in the velvet darkness, his equipment would again become a conduit for the dead. The voices, always from the same cursed patch of wilderness, belonged to those who had perished years, even decades ago. The most visceral terror arrived on a February night, the mercury plunging to 40 below, the aurora borealis painting the sky in spectral green ribbons. Marcus, seeking a moment of respite in the break room, nearly leaped from his skin as the emergency frequency crackled to life, delivering a transmission that froze his very blood. "This is Marcus Delqua calling for help. I am stranded at coordinates 61.4 degrees north, 161.8 degrees west. My vehicle has broken down and I am injured. Please send help immediately. I repeat, this is Marcus Delqua, requesting immediate assistance." The voice was his own, yet distorted by an impossible static, echoing from an impossible distance. Marcus listened, horrified, as he repeated the plea twice more before melting back into the white noise. His hands, clumsy with terror, fumbled with the logs. The signal's origin, the precise coordinates that had birthed all the other spectral calls. The rest of his shift dissolved into a stunned, silent vigil, his gaze locked on the malevolent hum of the radio equipment. There was no rational explanation, no scientific loophole for a distress call from himself, from a place he'd never seen. A terrifying possibility, a premonition rather than an echo, began to fester. Were these transmissions not ghosts of the past, but harbingers of the future? Was his radio somehow catching signals from souls destined to perish in that accursed wilderness? The dread that settled upon him was so profound, so suffocating, that he moved through the final hours of his shift like a man sleepwalking. The next morning, Marcus drove straight to the Bethel airport, buying the first ticket to Louisiana. He never looked back, never returned for his belongings, never completed his 18-month contract. The communications company eventually brought in another technician from the lower 48, a young man from Ohio who lasted precisely 6 weeks before vanishing, abandoning his post and Alaska without a word. Now Marcus thrives in the comforting cacophony of New Orleans, safely cocooned by the familiar rhythms of home. Yet sometimes, in the deep of night, when the atmospheric conditions are just so, he swears he can still hear them, those phantom voices, pleading for help from the Alaskan wilds, and he can never quite erase the sound of his own voice, desperate and afraid, calling out from coordinates he prays he will never, ever visit. The communications center in Bethel has seen a revolving door of technicians since Marcus's abrupt departure. The local authorities, scarred by countless tragedies, no longer dispatch rescue teams to that blighted stretch of wilderness. It remains empty, silent, save for the eternal chilling pleas of the phantom voices broadcasting into the unforgiving Alaskan night. Destiny Washington had always chased the horizon, but nothing in her polished Washington, D.C. life had prepared her for the raw, brutal majesty of Alaska. At 24, armed with a political science degree, she'd signed up for a summer stint at the Pacific Salmon Processing Facility in Ketchikan, lured by the promise of hefty wages and the irresistible call of the last frontier. What she found there, under the relentless Alaskan nights, would etch itself onto her soul. The cannery squatted on the edge of Tongass Narrows, a hulking metal beast, its corrugated steel walls streaked with rust and the gnawing bite of salt spray. Built in the 1940s, it had devoured millions of pounds of salmon over the decades, a magnet for seasonal workers drawn from every corner of the world by the promise of intense, lucrative work. Destiny arrived in May, when daylight stretched for 20 hours and the air still carried the crisp echo of winter. Charlie Tutok, her supervisor, a local Alaskan with a gruff exterior, assigned her to the night shift. The work was a relentless ballet of exhaustion, 12 hours standing, gutting and cleaning fish in the refrigerated cavern, the roar of industrial machinery a constant companion. Yet the pay was excellent, and Destiny found a strange, almost meditative rhythm in the repetitive motion, her hands working on autopilot as her mind drifted. For the first month, the cannery hummed with a predictable, if brutal, efficiency. 3 shifts kept the lines churning 24 hours during peak season. Destiny worked alongside a motley crew, college students from the lower 48, immigrants sending money back home, and local Alaskans piecing together a living. The night shift was smaller, quieter, a skeleton crew maintaining operations while the fishing boats were out at sea. It was in her second month that the anomalies began. Destiny was alone in the secondary processing area, sorting and preparing fish for canning, when she heard it. The familiar thrum and whine of machinery starting up in the primary processing room next door. This was wrong. The primary line only fired up for fresh deliveries, and none were scheduled until morning. Curiosity, a dangerous companion in the dark, tugged her towards the small window connecting the 2 areas. What she saw sent a cold tendril of dread snaking through her. The massive processing conveyor belt was running at full speed, salmon moving along the line in grim, perfect formation. Yet no fresh deliveries had arrived in over 6 hours. And the fish themselves, they were wrong. Their scales dull, lifeless, their eyes clouded with an oily film that caught the harsh fluorescent lights in grotesque ways. She tried the door to the primary processing area. Locked, from the inside. When she radioed Charlie, his voice, thick with sleep, assured her the primary line had been shut down hours ago, that no one else was in that section of the building. But Destiny could see the machinery running, could hear the rhythmic thump of fish dropping into bins, could smell the cloying, metallic tang of salmon flooding through the ventilation system. It happened again the next night, and the night after. Always in the dead hours between midnight and dawn, always when Destiny was alone in her section. The primary processing line would mysteriously spring to life. She began a meticulous log, recording the exact times, the sounds, the peculiar smells that accompanied these phantom operations. But what truly burrowed under her skin were the fish. During her daytime explorations, when she should have been sleeping in her cramped dorm, Destiny found the processing bins in the primary area always full after these spectral night runs. But a closer inspection revealed a chilling truth. These were not the current season's catch. The species were wrong, varieties unseen in Alaskan waters for decades. The flesh discolored, a waxy, unnatural texture that bore no resemblance to fresh fish. When Destiny voiced her unease to Charlie, he laughed it off, a sound as brittle and false as old ice. Old buildings make strange noises, he'd insisted, eyes skittering away from hers. Equipment runs on timers. You're just unaccustomed to the sounds. But Charlie never volunteered for the night shift himself, and when she pressed him about the cannery's past, he became as elusive as smoke, changing the subject with practiced ease. It was Martha Kayahat, a woman whose movements were as stiff as antique hinges, but whose eyes held the deep knowing of the land, who finally pulled back the veil. Martha had grown up in Ketchikan, had seen the cannery rise from the earth, consuming the ancient fishing camp that had sustained her people for centuries. "My grandmother used to tell stories about that place," Martha said, her voice a hushed whisper, her gaze darting around the empty break room as if the walls themselves had ears. "Before the white man came, our people caught salmon here, summer after summer, for generations. The spirits of the fish were honored, thanked for their sacrifice. Protocols were followed to ensure they would always return." She paused, lifting a chipped mug to her lips, her weathered hands trembling just noticeably. "When they built this place, they ignored it all, tore down sacred sites, poured concrete over ceremonial grounds, started processing fish like they were just commodities, not living beings with spirits." Martha's voice grew fainter, laced with a familiar sorrow. "My grandmother said the salmon spirits wouldn't be ignored forever, said someday they'd find a way to continue their ancient migration, with or without our permission." A chill, deeper than the refrigerated air, snaked through Destiny. "You think the fish I'm seeing are spirits?" Martha nodded, a solemn dip of her head. "The old salmon runs, the ones that came through here before overfishing and climate change disrupted everything. They're still following the ancient pathways, still trying to complete their life cycle. This cannery was built on top of their spiritual highway. That doesn't mean they stopped using it." That night, a new resolve hardened in Destiny. She positioned herself across from the primary processing area, waiting in the near darkness. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the machinery roared to life. This time, instead of only watching through the reinforced window, Destiny slid her security card into the cold metal slot, unlocking the connecting door. The sight that greeted her defied every rational thought. The conveyor belt churned, laden with salmon that moved with an internal, sickening rhythm. Though decades dead, their scales possessed the translucent sheen of ancient bone, and their vacant eyes pulsed with a faint, phosphorescent glow. The air was thick with a cloying scent, not the crisp brine of fresh fish, but the rich, musty odor of something submerged for far too long. Destiny watched, a horrified fascination pinning her to the spot as the ghost salmon glided through the processing line with a flawless, mechanical precision. Cutting blades descended in synchronized rows, sorting mechanisms whirred, and canning machines sealed products that should not exist. But as she leaned closer, a more chilling truth surfaced. Nothing was actually being cut, nothing processed. The machinery merely went through the motions, the fish passing through whole and untouched, as if the entire operation were a spectral theater, an endless, silent reenactment of their journey from life to commodity. The most terrifying moment arrived when one of the ghost salmon, caught in the endless loop of the conveyor, turned its ancient head. Its glowing eye fixed on her. Its mouth opened and closed in a silent gasp, as if struggling to speak the unutterable. And then, through the recycled air, Destiny heard it. A whisper that might have been words, a torrent of meaning she couldn't articulate but instantly grasped. A cocktail of profound sadness, simmering anger, and an inexplicable, aching longing for something irrevocably lost. Destiny backed away, slowly, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, its beat a thunderous counterpoint to the phantom whir of the machines. Just as her hand closed over the doorknob, every piece of equipment shuddered, then fell silent. The facility plunged into a suffocating quiet. The conveyor belt was empty. The bins gleamed clean. The overwhelming scent of ancient fish dissipated, as if it had been nothing more than a shared hallucination. She quit the next morning. Her bags were packed, a ticket booked for the first flight back to Washington, D.C. Before she could leave, Martha Kyahat found her, pressing a small, smooth pendant into her palm, a stylized salmon carved from whalebone. "For protection," the old woman murmured, her eyes holding Destiny's with an unnerving intensity. "In case they followed you home." Months later, back in the muted hum of D.C., Destiny was haunted. Nightmares of glowing fish eyes and the phantom thrum of machinery in empty buildings clawed at her sleep. She abandoned political science, her graduate school plans dissolving like mist, and instead pursued indigenous studies, focusing on the volatile intersection of traditional ecological wisdom and modern industrial greed. Alaska remained a scar she never touched again, but she often wondered about that Pacific salmon processing facility, about the ghost salmon still running their eternal, silent line through the dead hours of the night. Her research revealed similar phenomena. Reports from industrial sites built over ancestral hunting and fishing grounds across the Arctic, places where humanity's old agreements with the natural world had been not just forgotten, but desecrated. The carved salmon pendant, cool and smooth against her fingertips, sat on her desk, a constant, tangible reminder that the veil between living and dead, past and present, was thin, permeable. And sometimes, late at night, alone in her apartment, she swore she could still hear the distant thrum of machinery, still smell the unmistakable, ancient scent of fish, carrying messages from a world modern society had tried so desperately to excise from memory. The spirits of the salmon, she knew, continued their eternal migration, processing through facilities that existed in both corporeal and spiritual realms, following pathways etched into the land long before humans arrived, and which would endure long after the last cannery rusted into dust. They were patient, persistent, utterly indifferent to human schedules and industrial efficiency. They had a sacred task, ancient protocols to follow, and no amount of concrete or steel could ever truly halt their endless journey. Destiny Washington had learned that some jobs carried responsibilities far beyond employee handbooks, and some workplaces operated under rules far older and more complex than any human legislation. The cannery, she knew, still processed its phantom catch every night. And somewhere, within that endless cycle of spiritual fish moving through ghostly machinery, the old agreements were still being honored, remembered by beings who understood when respect for the natural world was not merely a philosophical concept, but the very marrow of survival. Kimiko Nakamura Williams had always believed the world held more depth, more strangeness, more mystery than most allowed. At 29, the award-winning photographer from Portland, Oregon, specialized in extreme landscapes. Storms, mountains, volcanic fields, the wild, lonely places where the earth still breathed raw and untamed. But even those adventures, vivid as they were, paled beside the stark, primal allure of Alaska. Here, the land was Earth's memory, the sky, a living canvas. Beneath both lived legends and darkness no lens could truly capture. This was her third pilgrimage to Utqiagvik, the northernmost settlement in the United States, chasing the elusive, fabled auroras. This winter, storms had lashed the coast for weeks, trapping most residents indoors. Kimiko, however, grew restless, a vibrant energy coiled beneath her stillness. Her partner, Samuel, texted daily warnings from Anchorage. "Stay in the hotel. Play it safe. The polar night is dangerous. You know the stories." But her patience had worn thin, frayed by the endless gray. After a particularly savage blizzard finally receded, leaving behind a stark, glittering silence, Kimiko packed her camera, a trove of extra batteries, her tripod, layers of thermal gear, 2 flasks of hot tea. Then, alone, she stepped out into the barren, breathtaking darkness of the North Slope's untamed tundra. For Kimiko, night in Alaska was no simple closing of a curtain. It was a profound transformation of reality. She trudged through powdery snow, the ice crunching a rhythmic counterpoint beneath her heavy boots, her breath plumed in shining clouds, dancing in the pale glow of her headlamp. Out across the flat, boundless horizon, ribbons of luminous green and violet shimmered through the thin clouds, the first sign in days that the auroras were returning. Just one perfect shot, she told herself. The northern lights, twisting like celestial dancers above a skeletal driftwood fence. The twin bluffs a shadowy presence in the distance, a faint glow on the horizon, hinting at the cold, wild stars above. She set up her tripod, adjusted her exposure with practiced ease, and waited, her heart beating a slow, silent rhythm synchronous with the Arctic air. The silence was absolute, a living, sentient thing that pressed in from all sides. Hours bled into stillness. The auroras strengthened, their luminous curtains climbing ever higher, burning with an almost painful intensity. Kimiko clicked frame after frame, mesmerized by the sky's ever-shifting choreography. But tonight, a discordant note vibrated through the spectacle. The lights rippled in strange, new ways, converging into arches so sharply defined they looked almost unnatural, segmented like a stained glass window shattered across the vast expanse of night. She zoomed in with her long lens, seeking detail, truth. And then, behind the aurora, through it, she saw them. Shadows. A flicker of movement that didn't belong, long, spindly forms, deeper than black, not the fleeting shadows of cloud or crag. These were figures, tall as telephone poles, their arms outstretched as if trying to tear through the luminous veil of light itself. She blinked, rubbed frost from her lens, trying to convince herself it was merely an illusion, born of cold and exhaustion. Tricks of the eye, she told herself, a desperate attempt by the brain to force pattern on cosmic chaos. But then it happened again. And again, each photograph, the outlines clear as ice crystals, the shadows themselves shifting, drifting closer to the foreground as the aurora danced. Kimiko, clawing at rationality, fumbled with her camera, extending the exposure. The screen flickered, a tiny defiant sun in the biting dark. Click, count, click again. In the 10th frame, one of the shadows had crept nearer than before. Now it was sharply defined, its face a hollow emptiness, arms angled as if reaching. A deep surge of terror, cold and visceral, crawled up her spine. These weren't technological glitches. She felt it, a pressure like static electricity, the very air humming with a quiet, menacing sentience. And then, a subtler sensation began, a ringing in her ears, growing louder until it vibrated in her skull. The edges of Kimiko's vision pulsed. She tried to pack up, but her hands moved clumsily, her balance betraying her. The lights overhead quickened, spiraling in a frenetic dance, illuminating not just the frozen land, but what now stood openly upon it. All around her, in the spaces where the aurora burned brightest, ghost-like silhouettes emerged, dozens, perhaps hundreds. Tall and gaunt, their forms semi-transparent, yet distinctly apart from the night, they pressed at the borders of her reeling vision, leaning in. The ground beneath them shimmered like disturbed puddles. Kimiko staggered backward, falling to one knee. For a brief, nightmarish instant, the air itself seemed to split with an inaudible scream. Then, impossibly, the shadows began to move, sliding across the snow without disturbing a single flake. In her mind, a cacophony erupted, dozens of distant, wordless voices full of longing and despair. Each voice shaped like a memory she couldn't quite recall. She clawed her camera from the snow, abandoning her tripod, and nearly crawled toward her snowmobile. Every few yards, she fought the urge to glance behind, to see if the silent figures had gained. Terror propelled her forward. When Kimiko reached her snowmobile, it was dead. The electronics flickered once, weakly, then died entirely, as if something from the sky had drained the batteries dry. For long minutes, her only company was the crackling static of her own nerves and the swirling luminance overhead. In desperation, she pulled out her emergency radio. Only a high, ghostly wail answered, mingled with what sounded like distant voices uttering unspeakable syllables. Sobbing, Kimiko huddled beside her pack, her numb fingers struggling to operate the camera. She scrolled through the frames. In every single one, the shadows had drawn closer, until she found it. A face, just outside her headlamp's glow. Its features were an agonizing ambiguity, perhaps pleading, perhaps hungry, perhaps both. For hours she sat there, listening to the aurora hum like the world's saddest violin, waiting for a dawn that would never come. In the Arctic winter, the sun rose only for a handful of moments and wouldn't return in earnest for weeks. She drifted in and out of shivering sleep, haunted by visions of impossibly long arms reaching, by eyes she could never quite see. Eventually, morning brought a search party Utqiagvik locals who'd seen her abandoned tripod and followed her snowmobile's tracks by headlamp and intuition. They found Kimiko shivering, eyes wide and wild, clutching her camera like a lifeline. They bundled her onto their sled and sped her back to town, where elders muttered blessings against the spirits that stalked the dark tundra. Weeks later, in the sterile safety of her hotel, Kimiko processed her images. The digital anomalies were still there, forms that shouldn't be, faces that couldn't exist, each more defined where the auroras raged brightest. She learned from the elders that the Inupiat have long believed the northern lights are more than just light. They are spirits of the dead, or portals to other realms, or the veils of ancient ones who sometimes try to return when the sky opens wide. The villagers told her she had been lucky, or perhaps unlucky, to have come so close. When the sky dances most wildly, an old Inupia woman had warned, never answer if you hear your name whispered, or the ones in the lights will find a way to pull you through. Kimiko left Utqiagvik with her art portfolio forever changed, and her certainty forever shaken. For the rest of her life she would avoid photographing auroras, unable to shake the feeling that something in the sky had seen her, too, and might one day come looking for her when the darkness returned. Thomas Tom Bay had learned about respect from his grandmother long before he ever set foot in Alaska. Growing up on the Navajo Nation in Arizona, he was taught that the land held memories, that certain places demanded acknowledgement, and that ignoring the warnings of elders could bring consequences that lasted generations. When he moved north, chasing the dream of running the Iditarod, he carried those lessons with him, though he never expected to need them in quite the same way. Tom had always been drawn to sled dogs. There was something about their fierce loyalty, their incredible endurance, and their ability to navigate treacherous terrain that spoke to him on a fundamental level. After years of training in the lower 48, he finally saved enough to purchase a team of experienced racing dogs from an old Norwegian musher named Eric outside Fairbanks. Eric had warned him about certain sections of the trail, but Tom assumed he meant natural hazards, thin ice, sudden blizzards, whiteout conditions. It was only later, after months in Alaska, after he'd begun to know the local Inupiat elders, that he started to understand the deeper meaning behind Eric's cryptic warnings. Mary Kunguk, an old Inupiat woman who ran the general store, took a liking to Tom, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit, someone who understood the importance of traditional knowledge. Over steaming mugs of tea on long winter evenings, she began to share stories her own grandmother had told her. Tales of places where the spirits of the dead still walked, where ancient things slept beneath the snow, and where even the bravest hunters feared to tread. There are sections of the old trails, Mary confided one evening, her weathered hands wrapped around her mug, where the Tornak once lived, the giant people, the ones who came before us. They were not evil, but they were not human either. And when they left warnings behind. The dogs know. They can smell the old anger, the old sadness. A wise musher listens to his dogs. Tom nodded politely, filing the information away as interesting folklore, but not immediately practical. His focus was on training, on building the stamina and teamwork necessary for the 1,000-mile race that would test everything he had learned about survival in the Arctic wilderness. His first real encounter with the supernatural came in late February during what was supposed to be a routine training run along a section of the Iditarod Trail. It wound through dense spruce forest, about 50 miles northeast of his base camp. The weather was perfect for mushing cold, but not brutally so, with just enough wind to keep the dogs alert without creating dangerous conditions. His team was running beautifully, moving in perfect synchronization across the packed snow, their breathing steady, their pace sustainable for the long haul. Nanook and Kota, two experienced Siberian huskies who'd run the Iditarod 3 times with their previous owner, led the team. Intelligent, reliable, they had never given Tom reason to doubt their judgment, which was why he was so surprised when they suddenly began to slow, their ears flattening against their heads as they approached what looked like a perfectly ordinary section of trail winding between tall evergreens. At first, Tom assumed they'd caught the scent of wildlife, a moose, perhaps, or a bear den. He called out encouragement, urging them forward, but instead of responding, both dogs came to a complete stop and began to whimper. The rest of the team bunched up behind them, and within moments, all 12 dogs were showing signs of extreme agitation. Tom set his snow hook and walked up to examine the trail ahead. To his eyes, there was nothing unusual, just the familiar ribbon of packed snow disappearing into the shadows between the trees. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional creak of branches in the wind, and the air carried only the clean, sharp scent of snow and pine. But as he stood there, trying to understand what had spooked his dogs, he began to feel it too. A subtle wrongness that made his skin crawl and sent his grandmother's warnings echoing through his memory. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, though his thermometer showed no change. The wind died completely, leaving a silence so profound that his own heartbeat sounded thunderous in his ears. And then, From somewhere ahead in the forest came a sound that made every nerve in his body scream in alarm, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Tom's dogs began to howl in unison, a mournful sound that spoke of fear deeper than any natural instinct. Nanook pulled against his harness, trying desperately to turn the team around, while Koda had dropped to his belly in the snow, trembling with terror. The other dogs were backing up, tangling their lines in a desperate attempt to retreat from whatever lay ahead. As the drumming grew louder, Tom began to hear other sounds layered beneath it, voices singing in a language he did not recognize. The air in the forest thickened, heavy and cold, as a sound like vast, dragging footsteps echoed through the trees. Bone scraped against stone, a chilling counterpoint to the deep thudding. Tom froze, every instinct screaming. He'd heard his grandmother's cautionary tales about the spirits of the land, and this was beyond any story. Without an instant's thought, he clawed at the snow hook, wrenching it free, and shouted a desperate command to his team. The dogs needed no urging. Terror galvanized them, transforming them into a blur of fur and muscle. They tore through the snow, a pace suicidal in its desperation, leaving that cursed patch of woods behind them. Miles melted away beneath their paws before the frenzied panic began to recede. Tom finally brought them to a halt, his own breath ragged, and painstakingly checked each animal. Beyond hammering hearts and frantic panting, there were no physical injuries. What truly unnerved him was the way their ears remained pricked, swiveling back toward the trail they'd just fled, as if tracking an unseen pursuit. That evening, he drove straight into town, a single name on his lips: Mary Kanguk. He found her amidst the warmth and clatter of the community center, teaching the intricate dance of beadwork to a circle of lively children. The moment she saw his face, her smile faded. She dismissed her small class gently, then led him out into the biting Arctic evening, along the frozen shoreline of the lake. "You went to the forbidden place," she stated, her voice quiet, before he could even begin. "I see it in your eyes. The dogs warned you, and you listened. That is good. That shows wisdom." Tom recounted the haunting sounds, the palpable fear, the inexplicable dread. Mary listened, her face a mask of solemn understanding, the steam of her breath a visible cloud in the frigid air. When he finished, silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of the wind. "That place has been forbidden for longer than anyone living can remember," she finally said, pulling her parka tighter against the encroaching chill. "My grandmother's grandmother spoke of what happened there when the world was new. There was a village once, a place of plenty, where people honored the land and the spirits, but they grew proud. They began to take more than they needed, to dismiss the old agreements with the Tornet, with the ancient ones." Her gaze drifted over the frozen expanse of the lake. "The spirits tried to warn them, just as your dogs warned you. But they would not listen. They called the old ways foolish superstition, believing their own strength was all they needed to claim whatever they desired from the land. So the spirits withdrew, and the Tornet came in the night, not to destroy, but to teach. They drummed the people into the earth, into the trees, into the very stones." A shiver, colder than the wind, traced its way down Tom's spine. "What happened to the people?" "They became part of the warning," Mary replied, her voice tinged with sorrow. "Their voices joined the ancient song, adding their own grief to the chorus. That is why the dogs fear that place. They hear the endless lament of all who scorned the spirit's wisdom, and they know some paths lead only to becoming lost forever." In the weeks that followed, Tom meticulously redrew his training routes, avoiding even the periphery of that forbidden section. He found himself paying heightened attention to his dogs, learning to interpret the subtle shifts in their posture, the tremor in a paw, the anxious flick of an ear that signaled a perception beyond his own. There were other places along the ancient trails that caused his team unease, though none as profoundly as that first, terrifying encounter. Race day arrived, crisp and bright. Tom's team, finely tuned, ran beautifully, securing a respectable mid-pack finish for a first-time musher. Yet the trophies and the cheers faded from his memory. What remained was a moment, 2/3 of the way through the race, when the trail veered near the forbidden forest. Miles distant, a ripple of unease spread through his team. Nanook, the lead dog, cast anxious glances towards the dark line of trees on the horizon, his ears swiveling, catching echoes of something Tom could not hear. Without a command, the entire team surged forward, pulling with renewed urgency, an unspoken pact to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the shadows that waited. Tom never ran the Iditarod again. He continued to train and race dogs on shorter courses, but the encounter had irrevocably altered his relationship with the wild. He had glimpsed something vast, primeval, and utterly indifferent to human ambition, a world governed by laws far older than his own. A few years later, he moved south to Arizona, establishing a program on the reservation, teaching traditional tracking and outdoor survival to young people. He always began his classes the same way, with a story about the profound importance of listening to the warnings of elders, both human and animal. He never shared the specific, chilling details of what he'd faced in Alaska, but he instilled in his students the understanding that the natural world held forces demanding respect, and that ignoring them came with consequences that could stretch across generations. His dogs, he would often say, had saved him by refusing to enter a place where ancient spirits still drummed their warnings into the frozen earth. This was a lesson Tom carried to his last breath. Some places are inviolable, some paths untraveled, and the wisdom to discern the difference is often the thin line between survival and joining the eternal chorus of the lost. The Tornet, he believed, still walked those dark woods, their ancient rhythms echoing in the night, a counterpoint to the mournful song of those who had ignored their wisdom, a stark reminder that pride and disrespect for the old ways demanded an immeasurable price. Tom, the musher, had learned to listen to his dogs, and through them, to the very pulse of the land, understanding that true wisdom lay not in conquest, but in humility within its boundless power. Caleb O'Sullivan, a young man forged in the crucible of South Boston, was driven by a deep, quiet purpose. In his Irish-American family, education was not merely valued, it was a sacred pursuit. He'd watched his parents sacrifice, working multiple jobs to send his older siblings to college. When his turn came, Caleb chose education, determined to mend the fractured pathways for children denied quality schooling. Graduating from Boston College with his teaching degree, he sought out the most remote corners, places where his skills were desperately needed. The offer from Nukamak, a village of fewer than 200 souls, nestled deep in the Alaskan bush, felt like a summons. Nukamak existed beyond the reach of roads, accessible only by a fragile thread of small aircraft. The previous teacher, he learned, had vanished abruptly mid-year, leaving a void and no explanation. The school superintendent in Bethel hadn't sugar-coated the reality. Extreme isolation, brutal weather, and cultural chasms that could swallow an outsider whole. Yet, the salary was competitive, and the chance to make a profound difference irresistible. Caleb arrived on a cold September morning, the tundra already sketched with winter's first icy breath. The village was a modest cluster of houses centered around a community hall, a general store that doubled as the post office, and the school a unassuming 2-room building serving kindergarten through 8th grade. High school students were sent to boarding schools in larger towns, a policy that, over the years, had woven threads of tension into the community. The school itself, built with federal funding in the late 1990s, stood apart from the older structures. Modern heating hummed, electricity powered by diesel generators flickered, and internet, when the weather behaved, offered a fragile connection to the outside world. Caleb's living quarters, a small, sparse but functional apartment, adjoined the school, a kitchenette, a sleeping area, and a small office for lesson planning. His students, a vibrant mix of ages from 5 to 14, totaled 18 from 12 families. Most were Yupik, with a few mixed heritage children whose families had drifted in from other parts of Alaska. Caleb had studied basic Yupik and cultural practices, but the polished words in his textbooks were a distant echo of the vibrant, living reality of the village. For the first few weeks, a quiet rhythm settled over Nukamac. The children, initially shy, slowly warmed to Caleb's genuine enthusiasm and deep respect for their heritage. He began to weave local wisdom into his lessons, inviting elders to share their stories and traditional ways. Parents offered warm, approving nods, and Caleb felt the first stirrings of belonging, the certainty that he was truly making a difference. It was in early October that a subtle discord entered his perfectly orchestrated world. During a free drawing period, Caleb's gaze snagged on a recurring image among his students' artwork. Several children, seemingly independently, were creating remarkably similar drawings. The intricate patterns of spirals and geometric shapes were what first caught Caleb's eye. Designs far too sophisticated for children so young. When he asked, the students would glance at each other, a nervous flutter in their eyes, and mumble about the other teacher. Confusion pricked him. Caleb was the only teacher in the tiny village of Nukamac, and the previous one had vanished months before these strange symbols began appearing. "The night teacher shows us things when you go to sleep," 10-year-old Mary Tulamac explained, with an unsettling matter-of-factness. Caleb, intrigued rather than alarmed, initially dismissed it as some form of traditional cultural education, common in many indigenous communities. He made a mental note to connect with the village elders, eager to weave his curriculum into their ancient practices. But as weeks bled into a month, the classroom shimmered with an inexplicable shift. The children began to exhibit knowledge far beyond their years, complex mathematical concepts, an astronomical understanding that bordered on prophetic, and most disturbing of all, perfect script in what appeared to be an archaic language no elder could identify. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came during a parent-teacher conference in late October. Caleb was detailing 8-year-old Tommy Aaron's astonishing progress in mathematics, a third grader effortlessly tackling algebraic equations. When asked where he'd learned such techniques, Tommy echoed Mary, a whisper of a shared secret. "The night teacher showed me." Robert and Susan Aaron exchanged quick, worried glances. "There is no night teacher," Susan said softly, her voice barely audible. "We thought Tommy was learning these from you." That evening, a chilling resolve settled over Caleb. He waited until the village lights winked out, then slipped into the schoolhouse. It was a skeletal silence, broken only by the shudder of the wind against the windows. The air, barely warm to keep pipes from freezing, bit at his skin. He sank into a chair in the back, telling himself he'd see nothing but the play of security lights. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., the transformation began. The temperature plummeted, a visible fog of breath clouding the air. A faint, phosphorescent glow seeped from the very walls, and the desks and chairs began to glide, rearranging themselves in an eerie ballet into a perfect circle. On the blackboard, symbols bled into existence, the same intricate patterns from the children's artwork. They arrived then, not through door or window, but seeming to materialize from the air itself. At first glance they were children, but their proportions were subtly wrong too tall, their limbs elongated, faces ageless, ancient. Their clothing, traditional Yupik, shimmered with an impossible inner light. These phantom students took their places, their forms barely solid, and studied the blackboard. Information streamed into their silent minds. Complex formulas, astronomical charts, and linguistic patterns flowed from the board with terrifying efficiency. The true horror dawned on Caleb. These spectral students were teaching his human children. Translucent projections of Tommy Aaron, Mary Tulamac, and most of his class flickered into existence, still asleep in their beds, but somehow present. They sat in the circle, learning impossible lessons with supernatural speed. For an hour, Caleb watched, a growing dread tightening its grip. The subjects were unthinkable for elementary schoolers: quantum physics, advanced mathematics, the histories of civilizations that had never existed, languages preceding human presence in Alaska. The night teacher, an adult echo of the phantom children, communicated without a sound, knowledge flowing directly into the minds of its spectral and human students. At 3:17 a.m., the symbols vanished, the desks returned to their places, and the phantom figures dissolved. Caleb was left in the dark, shaking, the cold seeping into his bones, and the implications of what he had seen chilling him to the core. The next morning, a fragile normalcy hung in the air. His students watched him with knowing eyes, as if his discovery was an open secret. Their schoolwork continued to astound, but now Caleb understood the source. He tried to research the phenomenon, reaching out to anthropologists and experts, only to be met with disingenuous phrases about stress-induced hallucinations. The children clung to a nervous silence when questioned about the night school, murmuring about the old ones. The village elders, too, were evasive, their silence a wall Caleb couldn't breach. The situation escalated in November. The night school was changing the children, not just academically. They recoiled from games and interaction, preferring abstract concepts. Their art became terrifying, depicting impossible landscapes. Most disturbing was their unison speech, finishing each other's sentences with chilling synchronicity. When Caleb confronted them, Mary Tulamac, her small face grave, looked at him with an ancient pity. "You cannot understand yet. You are still learning the old way. The night teacher says some people take longer to receive the true knowledge." That night, Caleb decided on a confrontation. He positioned himself in the center of the classroom before 2:17 a.m. As the phantom children materialized, he held his ground. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling but firm. "What are you teaching them?" The spectral teacher turned its attention to him. Cold fingers seemed to trace the surface of his mind as its voice echoed within his skull. "We are the ones who came before. We are the teachers of the deep knowledge, the wisdom your people have forgotten. These children are chosen to carry the old learning into the new time. You may join them if you wish to understand." An overwhelming temptation seized Caleb, the promise of answers, of knowledge that could reshape humanity. But the vacant, distant look in his students' eyes during the day was a stark warning. This education came at an unspeakable price. "What will happen to them?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They will become bridges between the worlds," the entity replied. "They will carry our wisdom to your people when your people are ready to receive it. But first, they must be fully prepared." Fully prepared, Caleb realized with a sickening lurch, meant more than just advanced learning. It meant transcendence, transformation into something inhuman, their individual consciousnesses subsumed by a collective knowledge he could never comprehend. The next morning, Caleb submitted his resignation, arranging immediate transport out of Nukamac. He left most of his belongings, all his meticulously planned lessons, defining his departure as a family emergency. But he knew, in his soul, he was fleeing. The replacement teacher lasted 3 weeks. The school district eventually closed the Nukamac facility, citing falling enrollment. The children were sent to boarding schools, their extraordinary abilities noted as exceptional talent, never supernatural intervention. Caleb returned to Massachusetts, but the night school and the children whose minds had opened to a knowledge not meant for human understanding remained etched in his memory, a silent, chilling testament to the unseen world. The phantom teacher's offer, seductive in its mystery, still pricked Caleb O'Sullivan late at night, a whisper of truths he deliberately walked away from, truths that coiled in the silent spaces between the papers he graded. He kept casual tabs on his former students over the years. Many dissolved into distinguished careers, their names etched into scientific breakthroughs, theoretical leaps that pushed the edge of human knowledge. Yet those who knew them intimately often spoke of their detached, almost ethereal composure, a way of speaking as if they drew whispers from sources beyond the ordinary scope of human experience. Even without a formal building, the night school persisted in Nukamak. Pilots, cutting through the Arctic winter gloom, sometimes reported inexplicable lights in the abandoned schoolhouse. Hunters, stooping over fresh tracks in the wilderness, occasionally stumbled upon children speaking in tongues unknown to any linguist. The village elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of generations beneath the endless sky, held their silence. Some knowledge they understood was too potent, too perilous for outsiders to ever grasp. Caleb had learned that teaching wasn't just about imparting facts. Sometimes it was about shielding minds from truths that could fundamentally reshape what it meant to be human. The line between education and transformation was a razor's edge, and crossing it meant stepping into a realm where reality's familiar boundaries simply ceased to exist. Music score. A low, shimmering hum begins, suggesting vast, cold landscapes and a faint, distant wonder. Dr. Priya Chatterjee Moore, climate researcher from the University of Michigan, lived for the extremes. Her fascination with humanity's edge, psychological and physiological adaptations to harsh environments, was a quiet obsession. So, when the National Science Foundation dangled a summer grant to unravel how the midnight sun warped sleep in remote Alaskan villages, she gripped it. What she unearthed during those endless, bright days would shatter everything she thought she knew about the fragile frontier between the conscious and the unconscious mind. Her station hunkered near Nuktak Pass, a small Inupiaq village deep within the Brooks Range, where the sun hung suspended for nearly 3 months. This facility, a legacy from 1980s Arctic research, offered the perfect crucible for her study of circadian rhythms' collapse in extreme latitudes. Her method was starkly simple: track sleep, dream activity, and mental well-being of local volunteers through the peak of the midnight sun. She'd brought a small arsenal of sophistication: EEG rigs, sleep study apparatus, psychological questionnaires, ready to document the unspooling of consciousness under perpetual daylight. Robert Aguk, the village elder, had finally granted permission after long, measured discussions about the study's potential good. Many residents grappled with the sun's relentless gaze, and Dr. Chatterjee Moore's research promised understanding, perhaps even strategies for future generations to navigate Arctic life's unique demands. For the first fortnight the rhythms of science held, she set her protocols, recruited a dozen volunteers from fidgeting teenagers to stoic elders, and began the quiet collection of baseline data. The early results were predictable, almost comforting: fragmented sleep, heightened activity, and vivid, often unsettling dreams, all signs of profoundly disrupted circadian rhythms. But as the study bled into its 3rd week, the pale blue sky holding the sun perpetually overhead, something unprecedented began to bleed from the data. Dr. Chatterjee Moore noticed her subjects weren't just experiencing individual sleep disruption. They were beginning to share dream content in ways that defied every neurological and psychological tether she possessed. The first tremor came during her daily interviews. Sarah Kunalak, a 28-year-old teacher, meticulously described a recurring dream, walking through a vast ice cave, glowing symbols carved into its walls. Later that same day, 16-year-old Tommy Aguk described an almost identical dreamscape, down to the intricate arrangement of symbols and the particular quality of light within the cavern. Initially, Dr. Chatterjee Moore filed it as coincidence, or perhaps a ripple of shared cultural imagery. Indigenous communities often possessed a common tapestry of myths, symbols that naturally wove into the dream state. But as she pressed on, the shared dream experiences grew too frequent, too surgically specific to be dismissed as mere cultural overlap. By the fourth week, all 12 participants were recounting variations of the same core narrative. They found themselves in a vast underground chamber, dozens of people seated in perfect stillness, eyes closed, yet their minds vibrantly awake. Within this dream, communication happened without words, thoughts and emotions passing with crystalline clarity. Most disquieting of all, they began to recognize the other dreamers, their fellow research subjects, meeting anonymously in some shared unconscious space. Her EEG monitoring confirmed the impossible. During reported shared dreaming, their brainwave patterns showed remarkable synchronicity. Alpha and theta waves, the signature of deep sleep, pulsed simultaneously across multiple subjects, even those sleeping in different corners of the village. The true breakthrough arrived when Dr. Chatterjee Moore, a scientist to her core, decided to hook herself up. Raised in Michigan, utterly new to the midnight sun, she expected her patterns to diverge. Instead, she found herself pulled into the very same shared dream space her subjects had so vividly described. The experience was unlike anything her scientific career had prepared her for. In the dream, she stood in that vast underground chamber, encircled by the still forms of her participants and dozens of others she didn't know. The space felt more real than reality, possessing a crystalline clarity that rendered normal waking consciousness a fog by comparison. At the chamber's heart stood a figure of pure light, not the harsh glare of the midnight sun, but a soft, golden radiance emanating warmth and an ancient, profound wisdom. When it spoke, its words imprinted directly onto Dr. Chatterjee Moore's mind, bypassing her ears entirely. "You came to study the endless light's effect on the human mind," the entity communicated, "but you have unearthed something far greater. When the gates between day and night dissolve, other boundaries become permeable too. The midnight sun opens doorways that remain locked in the normal cycle of light and shadow." Dr. Chatterjee Moore, in this wordless realm, responded with pure thought. "What kind of doorways? What is this place?" "This," the entity replied, "is the collective unconscious made manifest, a space where individual minds may converge, sharing experiences beyond physical restraints. Your people call it dreaming, but it is more. It is a return to consciousness's original state, before you learn to sever yourselves from each other, from the deeper rhythms of the natural world." As the entity spoke, Dr. Chatterjee Moore became acutely aware of every thought, every emotion in the chamber. She felt the deep, ancestral bond between the Inupiaq participants and their land, their consciousness interwoven with the Arctic's cycles. She experienced the dreams of strangers hunters, shamans, storytellers from generations past who seemed to exist in this space outside of time. Most profoundly, she began to understand. The midnight sun wasn't merely an astronomical event, but a gateway to a different awareness. Its perpetual light dissolved the lines between conscious and unconscious, allowing minds to merge, to share, in ways impossible under ordinary skies. When she awoke, the raw data of her research had been irrevocably transformed. EEG readings from the shared dreaming periods showed her participants' brain activity synchronizing not only with each other, but also with natural electromagnetic patterns emanating from Earth's magnetic field. The midnight sun, impossibly, was facilitating a form of consciousness that directly linked human awareness to planetary rhythms. Over the study's final weeks, Dr. Chatterjee Moore meticulously documented increasingly sophisticated forms of shared dreaming. Participants began to report prophetic dreams, accurately foretelling weather patterns, wildlife migrations, and other natural phenomena. They described receiving knowledge from deceased relatives, details proving historically accurate when later cross-referenced with tribal records. Most significantly, in their waking lives, these participants began to demonstrate an almost profound, unsettlingly enhanced empathy and emotional connection. The old grudges, brittle with years of silent festering, began to melt under the endless Arctic sun. Villagers who once navigated each other with guarded glances found an unexpected intimacy in their shared dreamscapes. They walked through ancestral memories, felt each other's buried hurts, and understood grievances unspoken for generations. Children, barely out of infancy, articulated complex traditional ecological knowledge with the clarity of elders, knowledge that typically demanded a lifetime of patient mentorship. It was as if the ancient wisdom of the land had found a new, direct conduit into their developing minds. Then, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the familiar rhythm of day and night returned. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the merged awareness began to fray. Dr. Chatterjee Moore, a woman whose name, if not her beliefs, suggested a certain gravitas, watched her EEG readouts flatten. The synchronized brainwaves, once a vibrant, pulsing symphony, returned to the chaotic but predictable individuality of disparate minds. The dream sharing, that profound, almost sacred communion, became a memory. Her participants, though retaining vivid recollections of their collective unconscious journey, could no longer access that unified state. Back in Michigan, surrounded by the stark objectivity of her lab, Dr. Moore grappled with data that felt less like equations and more like spiritual texts. Her findings, challenging the bedrock assumptions of consciousness, individuality, and humanity's bond with the planet's natural pulses, were met with polite skepticism, then outright dismissal. Mainstream journals deemed her work unscientific, impossible to bottle up and replicate in controlled conditions. Yet, the ghost of that Arctic connection, the feeling of utter belonging, wouldn't leave her. Undeterred by the academic cold shoulder, she turned her gaze to other extreme environments. Remote polar regions, dizzying high-altitude communities, places where the very fabric of light and darkness played by different rules, each offered a new canvas for her research. And there, tucked away in the margins of civilization, she found it again. Whispers of collective dreams, echoes of shared awareness. The midnight sun had been a classroom, teaching her that consciousness was not a fixed, solitary entity, but a fluid, interconnected force, far more flexible than Western science had dared to imagine. She realized then that the artificial barriers of everyday life, the routines and assumptions, were precisely what kept minds isolated. But in places where those barriers dissolved, where the natural world asserted its raw, unyielding power, individual consciousness could ripple and merge, pointing towards a fundamental unity hidden just beneath the surface of individual experience. Dr. Moore carried the indelible imprint of that perfect connection, the memory of her own merging beneath the ceaseless Arctic light. It had revealed a truth: the lines between self and other, past and present, human and nature, were not walls, but permeable membranes. Every summer, The midnight sun still ascended over Niktau Pass, casting its eternal glow, a silent invitation. It was a doorway, Dr. Moore understood, that only swung open when the familiar, comforting patterns of light and shadow yielded to the radiant, unbroken embrace of the Arctic summer, a testament to a deeper reality awaiting those brave enough to surrender their preconceived notions of consciousness and identity.